It is 2 hours before dawn on November 5th, 1274. The Korea Strait is black and absolutely still, the kind of stillness that feels less like peace and more like held breath. On the western shore of Tsushima Island, a Japanese samurai named So Sukakuni stands on a ridge above Komoda Beach, and he is staring at the sea. Something is wrong with the darkness. There are no stars on the water. Where the horizon should be open and empty, it is solid, dense, moving. And then, as the first grey light of pre-dawn begins to bleed into the sky, the shapes resolve themselves. Masts, hundreds of them, rising from the black water like a forest that grew overnight. 900 ships. Not a fleet. Not an armada. A horizon made of wood and iron, and the accumulated military genius of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Like a black serpent, 1,000 scales long, the Mongol invasion force swallowed the dawn whole. So Sukakuni turned from the cliff's edge and looked at his men. 80 of them. 80 samurai on horseback. 80 warriors who had trained their entire lives for the moment they would be called to defend this island. 80 men against 900 ships, carrying anywhere between 23,000 and 40,000 soldiers. And that number, historians still argue over it, honestly doesn't matter. It didn't matter then either. Whether it was 20,000 or 40,000, the math was the same. The math was impossible. So here is the question I want you to sit with for the next hour. Not could they win? They couldn't. Anyone on that ridge could see that. The question is, what do you do when the tide itself becomes your enemy? When every strategy, every weapon, every prayer you have is simply not enough? What do you do in the last hours before a storm that cannot be stopped? And a second question, because this story demands it, what happens to the people who don't fight? The farmers, the fishermen, the women of Tsushima who woke up that morning to the smell of cook fires and had no idea that before sunset their world would be gone. What happened on this island on November 5th, 1274, and in the brutal days that followed, didn't just change Japan. It changed the meaning of war itself. It introduced a civilization to horrors it had no language for. Forced a nation of warriors to confront an enemy that didn't fight by any rules they recognized, and set in motion a chain of events that would echo for 750 years. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit subscribe. We go deep on battles like this every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming in this series. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Seriously, I love seeing where this community reaches. We've had viewers from Japan, from Mongolia, from Korea, watching these same events from completely different ancestral perspectives. And that conversation in the comments is half the reason I make these videos. Now. Let's go back to that ridge. Let's go back to those 80 men, and let's understand fully, completely, without glossing over a single uncomfortable truth, exactly what was about to happen to them, and to the people they were sworn to protect. This is the horror of Tsushima. The year is 1266, and Kublai Khan is not a man who accepts silence as an answer. He is the grandson of Genghis, the founder of the Yuan dynasty of China, the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the human race. His holdings stretch from the frozen rivers of Poland in the west to the Pacific coastline in the east. He has swallowed China. He has swallowed Korea. He has swallowed Persia, Russia, and the steppes of Central Asia. He has done what no ruler before him managed to do, and what no ruler after him would manage either. He has made the known world small enough to hold in one pair of hands. And now he is looking at Japan. The Japanese archipelago sits just across the Tsushima Strait, barely 100 miles from the Korean coast he already controls. It is, by any strategic measure, the obvious next move. A wealthy island chain, with trade routes, resources, and the symbolic value of being the one place in the known East that has never submitted to anyone. Not to China at the height of the Tang dynasty, not to anyone. Japan has simply never been conquered, and to Kublai Khan, that fact is not a curiosity. It is an insult. He sends his first diplomatic mission to Japan in 1266. It is framed as an offer of friendship. But you don't frame friendship with the phrase submit or face consequences, and Kublai's letter, which describes itself as seeking friendly relations, also takes care to mention that it is written by the Emperor of the Great Mongols to the king of a small country, that Korea has already wisely submitted, and that it would be unfortunate if arms became necessary. The message underneath the silk and calligraphy is simple. You are next. Acknowledge it now and things will go easier for you. Japan refuses to respond, not refuses politely, not sends back a counter-proposal, simply does not reply. The Kamakura shogunate, the actual military government running Japan at this time, reads the letter, understands exactly what it means, and decides that the appropriate response to the most powerful man on earth is absolute deliberate silence. Kublai sends another mission, then another, then another. Between 1266 and 1274, he dispatches no fewer than 6 diplomatic missions to Japan, each one carrying increasingly direct language, each one turned away or simply ignored. One mission is physically stopped at the border by armed samurai, to which another is allowed to land but denied any audience with anyone in authority. The letters pile up, unanswered, in some archive in Kamakura, while the shogunate watches the Korean coastline and trains its warriors and prays to its gods. Now, picture Kublai Khan receiving the news that his 6th mission has been ignored. He is seated in his great hall at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and the man who delivers the report does so carefully because Kublai's silences are famous, and not for their tranquility. He does not explode, he does not rage, he simply goes still, in the way that deep water goes still before a storm front moves across it, and then he turns to his generals and says 3 words that will set 8 years of consequence in motion. Mobilize the fleet. His one defining trait, the thing every source from this period agrees on. Moors is not cruelty. The Mongols were no crueler than most medieval powers, and far more practical than most. His defining trait is a refusal to be refused. Kublai Khan has never encountered a problem that sufficient force could not resolve, and Japan is simply the next problem. He genuinely does not appear to have considered the possibility of failure. On the other side of this equation stands a man named Hojo Tokimune, and he is 21 years old. He is the regent of the Kamakura shogunate, the de facto leader of Japan, and he receives the final Mongol ultimatum in 1271, not with panic or with the desperate scrambling of a young leader in over his head. He receives it in a formal audience, surrounded by his senior advisors, and when the messenger finishes reading the letter aloud, Tokimune sits for a moment in absolute silence. Then he stands, draws his sword, and without a word to anyone walks out of the hall. He does not execute the messenger. He does not send a reply. He orders the construction of defensive walls on the coast of Kyushu and places every military force in Western Japan on permanent readiness. His one defining trait, the quality that will save his country, is a quality that almost looks like stubbornness from the outside, the absolute refusal to let fear become the first word in any sentence. But here is what Tokimune knew, what the historians tend to underplay, what we need to sit with for a moment before we talk about battles and beaches and arrows in the dark. He knew what the Mongols had done to the people who resisted them. He knew about Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty, left as a field of bones after the Mongol siege. He knew about Samarkand, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, erased from the map so completely that travellers a generation later couldn't find the ruins. He knew about Baghdad in 1258, when the Mongols killed so many people that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of books and red with blood, and the caliphate of 5 centuries ended in a single week. He knew about the campaigns in Poland and Hungary, where Mongol forces didn't just defeat armies, they annihilated populations, burned crops, collapsed the entire agricultural infrastructure of regions that took decades to recover. The Mongols were not simply a military threat, they were an extinction event that wore armour. And this knowledge, this specific and detailed awareness of what was coming, is what makes the silence of Tsushima's defenders so extraordinary. Sukekuni knew. Tokimuni knew. Every samurai who put on armour in November 1274 knew exactly what the Mongol Empire did to the people who stood in its path. They knew about the cities, they knew about the bones, they knew, and they stood up anyway. That knowledge lives underneath every moment of this story, and you should never let it leave your mind. Because out on that island, 8 days before the fleet arrived, something strange happened. The shrine to Hachiman, the god of war, the divine protector of Japan, stood in a remote forest on Tsushima, far from any village, surrounded by trees with no human habitation for miles in any direction. On the morning of October 5th, 1274, a fire broke out in that empty shrine. It burned intensely, then stopped. There was no explanation, no lightning, no cook fire, or no pilgrim who might have left a candle burning. And moments before the flames appeared, witnesses reported a flock of white doves, Hachiman's sacred birds, flying in from the north and landing on the shrine's roof. Sukekuni heard the report and did not dismiss it. He interpreted it exactly as the omen it appeared to be. He placed the island under military law, posted guards along every coast, and sent messengers to the mainland. He did not receive reinforcements. He received silence. The gods, it seemed, were trying to warn them. The mainland, it seemed, was not yet listening. So Sukekuni prepared with what he had. 80 men, the knowledge of what was coming, and a faith in something that the Mongols, in all their campaigns, had never yet encountered. The Japanese conviction that how you die matters as much as whether you live. The island of Tsushima is not a gentle place. It rises from the Korea Strait in two connected masses of land, steep and heavily forested, cut through with narrow valleys that funnel wind and rain and fog with a kind of geographical meanness. The coastline is jagged, coves and inlets and rocky headlands that make navigation treacherous for anyone who doesn't know the waters. In summer, it is beautiful in the severe way that all exposed places are beautiful, green against blue, sunlight hard on the waves. In November, it is grey and cold, and the sea mist comes in off the strait in dense banks that can drop visibility to nothing in 20 minutes. This terrain matters. Komoda Beach, on the northwestern tip of the southern island, is one of the few places on Tsushima where a large fleet can land in any quantity. The beach is perhaps a quarter-mile of open grey sand, backed by rising ground, not cliffs, but steep enough that mounted cavalry moving inland would be slowed. The forest begins immediately behind the rise. For a defender, it offers almost nothing. There is no high ground commanding the beach. There is no natural choke point where 80 men could hold thousands. There is only the sand, the sea, and the choice of where to stand. Sukekuni chose the beach, not the forest, where his cavalry would be useless, and where the Mongols' superior numbers would simply surround any position he took. Not the high ground, which offered views but no tactical advantage against a force that could simply go around. He chose the beach because if he was going to die defending Tsushima, he was going to die facing the enemy, in the open, on ground where every man with him could see the whole battlefield and make his own choices. This decision tells you everything you need to know about the man. Now understand the force arrayed against him. The Mongol invasion fleet was not, as the popular imagination tends to picture it, a horde of steppe horsemen transposed onto ships. It was a sophisticated combined arms military operation using 3 distinct types of vessels: large 1,000-dan transport ships carrying troops and supplies, Batulu, fast assault boats designed for rapid beach landings, and smaller tenders moving between the fleet to carry orders and supplies. The commanders Holtun and Hung Tsa-Kyu had run campaigns across the Asian continent. They understood logistics, they understood coordination, and they understood the psychology of overwhelming force. The soldiers themselves were a mosaic of conquered peoples. Mongol cavalry formed the officer corps and elite strike force. Han Chinese infantry from the former Jin dynasty provided the bulk of the assault troops. Jurchen and Khitan warriors, themselves peoples conquered by the Mongols a generation earlier, fought in specialized units, and the Goryeo Koreans, some volunteer, many conscripted, handled much of the naval and logistics work, providing the local knowledge of these waters that the Mongols lacked. This diversity was a strength. It was also, as we will see, a potential fracture point. Their weapons were the weapons of a civilization that had been refining military technology for 2 centuries of continuous warfare. The composite short bow, shorter than the Japanese yumi, but with greater range due to its layered construction of horn and sinew, allowed Mongol archers to fire accurately from horseback or from the confined decks of ships. The tetsuhao, iron shells packed with gunpowder, sulfur, and iron fragments, could be thrown or launched to detonate with a flash and a concussive boom that Japanese warriors had never experienced and had no framework to understand. These were not firebombs. They were the earliest hand grenades designed to wound, blind, and above all to terrify. Some accounts from Japanese survivors described the bombs making a noise like thunder, shooting out thousands of iron balls, the flash visible from a mile away. And the arrows. Mongol archers used arrows tipped with poison. Not always, not universally, but in sufficient numbers that even a grazing wound could kill a man hours after a battle, a fact that transformed the psychological calculus of every warrior who faced them. A samurai trained to accept a wound and keep fighting had to recalculate. A scratch was now a sentence. Against this, the defenders of Tsushima had the yumi, the Japanese longbow, a magnificent weapon at range, accurate, powerful, requiring years of dedicated training to master. They had the naginata, a curved blade on a long pole that was devastating in close quarters, particularly effective against mounted enemies and against men in formation if the wielder had enough space to swing. They had their swords, the curved forerunners of the katana, long and sharp, and built for a style of fighting that had been perfected over centuries of samurai combat against other samurai. And they had their armour, iron plate construction layered over leather, lacquered against weather, fitted to the individual warrior's body. Heavier than Mongol infantry gear, built not for the rapid mobility of steppe warfare, but for the measured, brutal close-quarters combat that Japanese warfare demanded. It would stop an arrow. It would not stop 100 arrows. On the night of November 4th, the men who would die the next morning prepared in the ways men have always prepared when they know what dawn will bring. Fires burned on the hillside above Komoda Beach. Small ones, careful, the kind that give warmth without announcing position, though position at this point was hardly a secret. The men cooked rice in silence. Some ate. Some couldn't. A samurai named Sukesada, we know his name only because of what he would do the next morning, sat apart from the others and sharpened his blade past any practical threshold, the sound of stone on steel a kind of meditation, a way of controlling the only thing left to control. Somewhere on that hillside, a young soldier whose name appears in no chronicle wrote a death poem. This was common practice among samurai facing battle. A short verse, often composed on the night before engagement, sometimes tucked into the armour, sometimes given to a trusted companion to deliver to a family member if necessary. We don't know what this anonymous young man wrote. We know only that the practice existed, that dozens of men on Tsushima likely performed it, and that most of those poems were never delivered because there was no one left to deliver them. Sukakuni walked among his 80 men in the hours before midnight. He did not give a speech. The sources don't record one, and I believe that silence because Sukakuni did not strike contemporaries as a man who used words when presence would serve. He walked. He stopped beside men he knew, placed a hand on a shoulder, looked at faces he had known for years. He was not inspiring them. He was witnessing them, acknowledging that they existed, that they mattered, that what they were about to do was seen. The sea was wrong that night. The waves were too quiet, the wind too still, as if the water itself was holding its breath against the weight of 900 ships floating on its surface. The scouts, who had been positioned along the coastal ridges, began returning around midnight one by one, each reporting the same thing in fewer and fewer words as the night went on. The fleet was moving. Sukakuni gathered his 80 men. No ceremony, no prayer that we know of. He looked at the sea, and then he looked at them, and then he said whatever it was he said. And history, which preserves the sound of battles, but not always the sound of the moments before them, does not tell us what those words were. Then, just before 2 a.m, the Mongol fleet dropped anchor in Komoda Bay, and the last silence of Tsushima ended. The drums started before the sun rose. Low at first, a single drum somewhere in the black mass of ships, a slow, measured beat that carried across the flat water with terrible clarity. Then another drum answered it, then another. By the time the first grey light began defining the horizon, the sound had become a physical thing, a vibration you felt in your chest before your ears understood it, a rhythm that said nothing and meant everything. We are here, we are organised, we have done this before, and we are not afraid of you. The smell came next. Smoke, but not the wood smoke of the hillside fires behind Sukakuni's men. Ship smoke. Salt-soaked timber smoke, the particular smell of 1,000 cooking fires on 1,000 vessels carrying men who had eaten the same rations across the same ocean for days. Underneath that, the iron smell of weapons and armour. And underneath that, something else, something chemical, sulphurous, wrong in a way that the samurai on Komoda Beach had no name for. Gunpowder. By the time the light was strong enough to show the full scope of the fleet, every man on that beach had understood, on some level below rational thought, that what they were looking at was not a force of nature in disguise. It was worse. It was organised. It was patient. It was waiting. The Mongol assault boats, the Batulu, low-slung and fast, began moving toward the beach in the first light. Not rushing, not screaming, moving with the quiet efficiency of men, executing a plan they had rehearsed and refined and already performed a dozen times on a dozen other coastlines, on a dozen other mornings just like this one. They came in formation, a wall of boats, and as they crossed the last 100 yards of open water, the archers in the prow of each vessel rose in unison. Sukakuni performed the ritual. He raised the ceremonial whistling arrow, the kabaraya, knocked it, drew, and released it into the lightning sky. The arrow screamed upward, its hollow tip catching the air, calling to the kami, calling to the gods of this island, calling to Hachiman in whatever divine space he occupied, saying, "We are here, we are ready, witness us." The Mongols heard the arrows scream and laughed. Not mocking laughter, not cruel laughter, the laughter of men who had seen this kind of thing before, the ritual gestures of armies who believed in ceremony and who knew precisely what came next. Before the kabaraya had finished its arc, before its whistling died in the salt air, the Mongol archers drew and fired, not one arrow, not a volley in the way samurai understood volleys, a release so synchronized, so massive, so absolute that the Japanese chronicles would later describe it as arrows falling like rain. Not metaphorically, but literally, a density of incoming fire that darkened the air the way heavy rain darkens the air. A phenomenon that no warrior on Komoda Beach had ever witnessed or prepared for, or had any tactical response to. But the samurai stood. This is the part of this story that history sometimes rushes past in its hurry to get to the larger conflict at Hakata Bay, and I refuse to rush it. Because what happened in the next minutes on Komoda Beach is one of the most extraordinary acts of collective will in the historical record, documented not by Japanese sources trying to glorify their own dead, but corroborated by the sheer tactical accounts that make no sense unless men did exactly what the chronicles say they did. The 80 samurai charged into the rain of arrows, into the assembled might of the most powerful military force on earth, on horseback, screaming their names and the names of their clans, because this was how samurai went to war. This was the only way they knew how to go to war. The announcement of self, the claim on the record of the battle, the declaration that if I die here, I die as a named man, not an anonymous corpse. They charged down Komoda Beach toward the landing boats, and a samurai named Sukesada, whose name we know precisely because the Mongols remembered him, rode directly into a cluster of infantry and killed 25 men before he was finally brought down. 25, individually, in personal combat. The Mongol sources acknowledge this because they had no reason to lie about it, and because the Japanese sources that record it were written decades later by people who had spoken to survivors. But 25 was not 800. And 80 was not the 3,000 the beach required. The Mongol formation closed around the charging samurai, the way water closes around a stone. No individual combat, no acceptance of single challenges. Unit tactics, envelopment, overlapping fields of fire. The machine of the Mongol army ground forward, and the individual heroism of the men from Tsushima, however real and however fierce, was simply not the right tool for what they were facing. A hammer against the tide. By mid-morning, the beach was theirs. The last cavalry charge came at dusk. A final desperate push by the remnants of Sukekuni's force, perhaps 20 men still mounted, still fighting, still screaming their names into an enemy that didn't care about names. The Mongol records note the charge clinically. The Japanese records describe it with the kind of language you use for sacred things. What both sources agree on is the outcome. Sukekuni died on that beach. His body was found where the charge ended, the sand around him dark, his armor bearing the imperial lineage of his bloodline, the lineage of Emperor Antoku, reaching back centuries to the divine origins of the Japanese ruling class, lying broken in the November sand, while the drums of an empire that had never heard of Emperor Antoku continued their patient beating from 900 ships. Every one of the 80 died, but what happened next? What the Mongols did after the beach was taken. For in the hours and days that followed, this is where the horror begins in earnest. The Mongols did not simply hold Komoda Beach and establish a military camp. They moved. Fast and systematically, they spread across the southern island, fanning out through the valleys and along the coast, hitting every settlement, every farmstead, every fishing village with the same organized efficiency they had applied to the beach assault. Houses burned. The chronicles record it plainly, without embellishment, because the plainness is sufficient. They killed so many people and burned and looted houses. The smoke was visible from the sea. But the smoke was not the worst of it. Zoom in for a moment to a fishing village on the eastern shore of Tsushima. Nameless in the records, one of dozens of similar places on the island. A family, perhaps, hiding in a fishing hut. A fisherman, his wife, their children. They have heard the drums. They have smelled the smoke. They have perhaps seen the distant firelight of burning homes on the hillside above Komoda Beach. They press against the back wall of the hut, the children silenced by instinct or terror or the pressure of a parent's hand, and they listen to the sound of boots on gravel outside. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know their names. The records don't preserve individual stories at this scale. What the records do preserve is the aggregate. The Mongols killed so many people on Tsushima that the island, which had been a functioning community of several thousand souls a week before, was reduced to silence. The Mongol commanders then sealed the island completely. Ships patrolling every approach, and soldiers on every path, so that no survivor could reach the mainland to warn Kyushu. The island fell silent, but not before a boy or a fisherman or someone, the sources are not clear, and the uncertainty itself is part of the record, managed to slip through the naval cordon in a small boat and begin the crossing to the mainland. He would arrive too late to matter to Tsushima. He would not arrive too late to matter to Japan, the children. The later records mention the children. Not graphically, not in detail, but the Yuan Shi, the official history of the Yuan dynasty, records in its account of the 1281 invasion that soldiers sought out the children and killed them as well. This was not anomalous behavior for the Mongol military in conquered territory. It was policy. It had been policy in China, in Persia, in Poland. See, children who survived became adults who resisted, and Mongol strategic thinking had no patience for future problems when present solutions were available. They were thorough. Then they sealed the island, restored military order among their forces, and the fleet, as large as before, its momentum unbroken, its discipline intact, moved south toward Iki Island. It was 13 days after the landings on Tsushima when the ships arrived at Iki, and the governor there, Taira Kagetaka, knew everything, or almost everything. He knew the fleet was coming. He knew Tsushima had fallen. He knew the garrison was dead. What he may not have known, what perhaps no one on Iki yet understood, was the full scope of what had happened to the civilian population of Tsushima in the days after the battle ended. When he had 100 samurai and an armed populace with improvised weapons. He sent the women and the children of Iki to Hinotsumi Castle first, the most defensible structure on the island, inland, protected. Then he led his 100 samurai down to the beaches to meet the landing force, which was 900 ships and an army that had just spent 2 weeks killing everyone on the previous island. The fighting on Iki's beaches lasted through the day. Kagetaka's forces were fierce. Japanese legend later recorded that the bravery of the samurai angered the Mongol soldiers rather than earning their respect, which tells you something about the nature of what they faced. But by nightfall, the defenders had retreated to the castle. By morning, the castle was surrounded. No reinforcements were coming. This was not cowardice on the mainland's part. Kyushu was scrambling, the full scope of the invasion only beginning to be understood. But the sea lanes were blocked, the Mongol naval screen was effective, and Iki was simply on its own. Kagetaka made one more decision before the end. He found his daughter, a young woman whose name the chronicles do not preserve, and gave her to a samurai named Sozaburo, with instructions, get her to the mainland. There is a hidden path to the shore, there is a boat. Go now, before the encirclement tightens. They made it to the boat. They pushed off from the shore in the grey morning light, and Mongol archers on the naval screen spotted them. The arrows crossed the water. Kagetaka's daughter died in the boat. Sozaburo, wounded but alive, because the sources tell us he delivered his report, which means he reached Hakata Bay, which means he survived the crossing, pulled the oars and left. In the castle, Kagetaka gathered what remained, 36 men for the last sortie. He rode out. 30 of them died on the field before the encirclement closed completely. Kagetaka returned to the walls, bleeding, the arithmetic of the day complete. He went inside. He gathered his family, his wife, his surviving children. And he made the choice that the Mongols, with all their efficiency and all their preparation, had not accounted for, the choice that their tactical doctrine, built on surrender or annihilation, had no category for. He killed himself. His family died with him. But the women who had been sheltered in Hinotsume Castle, the women Kagetaka had specifically tried to protect, they were taken. What happened to them is documented in Japanese sources that describe it with a restraint that makes the horror worse, not better. The Mongols held down the surviving women, stabbed them through their palms with knives, stripped them, and tied their bodies to the sides of the ships, not alive, not as slaves or as prizes, as objects, as messages. Their hands nailed to the hull boards through their lacerated palms, their bodies arranged across the bows and sides of the vessels, like a deliberate statement about what Japan was about to receive. Sit with that for a moment. The deliberateness of it. This was not battlefield chaos, not the accidental cruelty of men in the heat of combat. Someone gave an order. Someone made a decision that these women who had already died should be displayed in this specific way at this specific time. For it was before the fleet moved toward the Japanese mainland. This was a message, carefully composed, intended for a specific audience. The audience was the samurai of Kyushu. Standing on the shore of Hakata Bay on November 18th, watching the Mongol fleet approach across the grey November sea, watching the ships resolve out of the haze into specific shapes, into bows and hulls and the shapes of rigging, and seeing, before they could see faces or weapons or flags, what was arranged along those hulls. That image travelled. It crossed the entire country within days, faster than any horse, spreading through the information networks of the Kamakura shogunate like a cold fire, reaching every castle and every monastery and every common household in Japan. The Mongols had arrived, and they had introduced themselves. The Battle of Hakata Bay began on the morning of November 18th, 1274, and it was, by any objective measure, a catastrophe for the Japanese defenders that can only be called something other than a total defeat because of what happened to the Mongol fleet afterward. The Japanese forces at Hakata were more numerous than what had been available on Tsushima and Iki combined. Thousands of samurai from the Kyushu clans had been mobilized in the days since Sozaburo's desperate crossing, and the walls of the bay's approaches had been hastily reinforced. But more numerous meant different things depending on which side of the equation you were standing on. More numerous than 80 was not the same as enough. And what the Japanese found on the beaches of Hakata Bay was the full weight of Mongol tactical doctrine applied to a battle space where there was room to use it. The drums and gongs started before the landing. Not as ceremony, not as psychological warfare in the theatrical sense, but as command and control, the Mongol battle language. A system of sounds that transmitted tactical orders across a noisy battlefield more reliably than voice commands, more flexibly than signal flags. Individual unit commanders knew their cues. The entire army could pivot on a drum beat, the way a single soldier pivots on a command. The samurai of Hakata had never heard anything like it. And that unfamiliarity, that gap between the war they had trained for and the war they were suddenly fighting, was its own kind of wound. The first Japanese response was the one they knew. Commanders shouted their lineages, their hereditary ranks, their claims to martial glory, the formal challenge that had opened every significant Japanese military engagement for generations. We are the warriors of such and such clan, descended from such and such hero, and we call upon any man of worth to meet us in single combat. The Mongols didn't understand the words, wouldn't have cared if they had. The mass formation advanced without acknowledgement, and the arrows began. But not just arrows this time. The Mongols deployed their explosives at Hakata, the Tetsuhao, the iron bombshells, lobbed in arcing trajectories into the samurai formations, detonating with a crack of thunder and a spray of iron fragments and a flash of fire that had no equivalent in any Japanese warrior's experience. Horses screamed and bolted. Men who were untouched physically by the blast stood stunned, their training offering nothing useful for this particular moment, their bodies running threat assessment calculations for a weapon that didn't appear in any of their categories. And into that stunned moment, the Mongol infantry advanced, the samurai fought. Let no one ever suggest they didn't fight. Individual warriors who charged the Mongol lines and reached them found, in the close quarters of actual blade-against-blade combat, that their training and their weapons were often superior to what they faced. The Japanese sword outperformed the Mongol short sword in close range. That the naginata was devastating against infantry in tight formation if you could get the room to swing it. And the samurai archers, when they had a clear shot and sufficient distance, were among the most skilled in the world. But you could only use those advantages if you survived long enough to get to close quarters. And the Mongol tactical system was specifically designed to prevent that. Suppressive volley fire kept the samurai pinned. Poisoned arrows meant that even partial hits were death sentences on a delay. The formation tactics, units moving together, protecting each other, responding to drum commands, enveloping flanks, denied the individual combat that Japanese martial culture had been built around. The samurai were jewels thrown against a tide, beautiful, unbroken, and utterly irrelevant to the sea. By noon on November 18th, the Mongol forces had established a significant beachhead at Hakata Bay and were pushing inland. The Japanese defence was fragmenting, not rooting, not collapsing in fear, but fragmenting the way any force fragments when its tactical doctrine stops working, and its commanders have no alternative doctrine to switch to. Desperate charges that achieved local successes but couldn't be exploited. Individual acts of extraordinary violence that the chronicles would record and celebrate, but that the battle itself could not absorb. But there was a crack, a single crack, in the Mongol line that the battle would hinge on. A samurai's arrow found the Mongol general Liu Fuxiang. Through the armour, through the shoulder, not a killing shot, but a serious wound in the middle of a battle that required his active command. Liu Fuxiang left the field, for his units continued functioning. The Mongol command system was not dependent on any single general the way Japanese command systems were. But the loss of his presence introduced a hesitation at the operational level that would compound over the next 24 hours. And in the night, the samurai changed tactics. Not all of them. Not by formal decision, but small groups of warriors, men who understood that the tactics of daylight had failed and who were pragmatic enough to try something different, built or commandeered small boats and launched night raids against the anchored fleet. Under cover of darkness, without drums or banners or announced challenges, they rowed to Mongol ships and set them on fire. They boarded smaller vessels and killed crew members and disappeared back into the dark water before the alarm could spread. 3 warriors in particular, Kawano Michiari, Kusano Jiro, and Takazaki Suenaga, whose names come down to us because Suenaga later commissioned illustrated scrolls documenting his own deeds, set fire to a Mongol command ship, and reportedly took 20 heads in a single night's work. This was not Bushido. This was not the way the samurai code, as it would later be written, demanded that warriors conduct themselves. This was something older and more fundamental, the instinct of people fighting for their survival to use whatever works. The night raids couldn't win the battle, but they demonstrated something that the Mongol commanders had not expected, that the Japanese were capable of adaptation, capable of operating outside their own doctrine when necessity demanded it. Hours passed. The night of November 18th into November 19th, a night of flickering fires on the water, the crack of alarm signals, the distant sound of fighting in the dark, and the Japanese mainland holding its breath. Then, on the night of November 19th, the sky changed. It started with the wind. Not the normal November wind off the Korea Strait, cold and consistent and predictable. This was something else, a directional shift, sudden and sharp, followed by a drop in air pressure that the experienced Korean sailors on the Mongol fleet recognized immediately for what it was. They began warning their commanders, the commanders who had crossed the ocean and taken 2 islands and fought a day-long battle, and were deep in the logistics of consolidating a beachhead, had to decide whether to believe them. The Mongol generals ordered the fleet to anchor and hold position. This was the decision. Not a bad one by any standard military logic. Moving a fleet of 900 ships in darkness in coastal waters during shifting weather is a recipe for collision and loss. Better to anchor and ride it out. But these were not normal waters, and this was not a normal storm. The typhoon hit Hakata Bay in the middle of the night, with a force that no military planning document had accounted for because there was no document that could account for it. The winds, the meteorologists' reconstructions placed them at sustained hurricane force, possibly higher, hit the anchored fleet and began the work that the samurai of Tsushima and Iki and Hakata had been unable to do. And here is the brutal irony that the Mongol commanders, in the chaos of wind and wave and screaming timber, had no time to appreciate the chains and planks that connected many of their ships, the logistical linkages that made the fleet efficient, made it vulnerable. Ships that might individually have ridden out the storm at anchor were instead dragged by their connections into each other, hulls grinding and splintering against hulls, anchors torn free by the collective weight of multiple vessels under sail-force wind, entire sections of the fleet becoming interlocked masses of wood that the storm tumbled and smashed against the coastal rocks of Hakata Bay. 13,000 men drowned, not in battle, not heroically. In the dark, in the water, in the wind, tangled in rope and wreckage, or simply swept off the decks of ships that ceased to exist beneath them. The official Yuan dynasty histories, written to minimize the disaster, acknowledge devastating losses. Modern archaeological surveys of Hakata Bay have found wreckage consistent with catastrophic fleet destruction. By dawn on November 20th, the storm had passed. Japan still stood. The samurai came to the shore with the first light and looked at what the sea had done. Wreckage stretched for miles, timber, weapons, supplies, bodies, the physical evidence of an empire that had crossed an ocean and been turned back by something it couldn't fight and couldn't command. The remaining Mongol ships, perhaps 200 of the original 900, had cut their cables during the storm and run, limping back toward the Korean coast, with whatever men they'd managed to keep aboard. The samurai, who stood on the wreckage-strewn shore of Hakata Bay that morning, had not won, not in the tactical sense. They had not defeated the Mongol army in the field. They had been pressed back, outfought by superior tactics, watching their comrades cut down by weapons and methods they had no answer for. What saved Japan was not the samurai. What saved Japan was the sky. And the Japanese, standing in the dawn light surrounded by broken ships, looked up at the clearing sky and named what had happened. Kamikaze, the divine wind, the breath of the gods, the intervention of Hachiman, whose shrine had burned on Tsushima 3 weeks before, whose doves had gathered on the roof in the first morning of October, as if saying goodbye, whose warriors had died to the last man on the beaches before the wind arrived. They named it. They kept the name. And 670 years later, in a different November, in a different war, young Japanese pilots would take that name for their own, choosing to become the divine wind themselves, rather than wait for the sky to provide it. The horror and the heroism of Tsushima reaching forward through the centuries, finding new forms, asking the same terrible question. What do you do when the tide is your enemy? The counting of the dead took days, Tsushima first. The island that had been, 3 weeks before, a functioning community of several thousand people, farmers, fishermen, samurai, their families, the entire human infrastructure of a populated island was counted in its silence. The garrison, 80 dead, everyone. The civilian dead, the records do not give precise numbers. And the absence of numbers is itself a kind of testimony to the scale. What the sources tell us is that the Mongols killed so many people and burned so many homes that the island was functionally depopulated in the time it took the fleet to move south to Iki. On Iki, the garrison annihilated, Taira Kagetaka and his family dead by their own hands in Hinotsume Castle, his daughter dead in the water between Iki and the mainland. The armed populace who had stood beside the 100 samurai, farmers with improvised weapons who had done what the situation demanded and died for it, uncounted in any formal record, because people without names don't generate administrative paperwork. On the Mongol side, the battlefield casualties were real and significant, Sukesada's 25, and the losses from the night raids at Hakata, and whatever the samurai defenders exacted in the field before being overwhelmed. But these numbers, probably in the low thousands for the campaign itself, were dwarfed by the storm. 13,000 dead in a single night. Add the battle casualties and the maritime losses of the retreat, and the Yuan dynasty lost somewhere between a third and a half of the entire invasion force before a single soldier set foot on Kyushu's mainland in any permanent way. The Mongol commanders who survived the storm and the retreat wrote their reports to Kublai Khan from the Korean coast, and those reports are fascinating documents in the history of institutional self-preservation. The typhoon loomed large in the explanation. It was, after all, inarguably real and inarguably catastrophic. The samurai resistance was acknowledged but minimized. The logistical challenges were noted. The specific decisions that may have contributed to the disaster, anchoring in a typhoon-prone bay, the chained-together fleet, the strategic ambiguity about whether 1274 was a conquest or a reconnaissance, received considerably less analysis. Kublai Khan read the reports and began planning the second invasion immediately. This is the detail that tells you everything about who Kublai was, not the loss of 13,000 men. Not the destruction of most of his fleet, not the evidence that Japan was geographically and meteorologically hostile in ways that his continental military experience had not prepared him for. None of these things changed the fundamental equation. Japan had refused him. Japan needed to be answered. On the Japanese side, the man who had to process the aftermath was Hojo Tokimune, the 21-year-old regent who had ordered the envoys executed and the walls built, and who now stood at the far end of the worst 3 weeks in Japanese military history. He did not celebrate. His accounts from this period don't record celebration, and I think the absence is real. What Tokimune saw was not a victory. What Tokimune saw was a warning, delivered at enormous cost, that the storm would return. He was right. He began building. The stone wall along Hakata Bay, 19 kilometers of dressed stone, 2.8 meters high, the inner face sloped for mounted archers, the outer face sheer and vertical, designed specifically to prevent the kind of mass beach landing that had succeeded on Tsushima and Iki. Construction began in 1275 and continued for years, each consuming resources that the Kamakura treasury could barely provide, maintained by samurai clans who were stationed on perpetual coastal watch, their lives reorganized around the expectation of return. Walk Komoda Beach in the weeks after the battle, and the image you encounter is one that history struggles to hold because it resists any single frame. The sand has changed color in places, darker, near where the final cavalry charge ended. Broken arrows half buried in the waterline, their lacquered shafts fading in the salt air. Pieces of armor, not whole suits but fragments, a shoulder guard here, a faceplate there, separated from the men who wore them by the tide. The footprints of 900 ships, still visible in the disturbed sand of the shallows, the anchor gouges of a fleet that came and went. See, somewhere in the rocks above the beach, wedged in a crevice as if placed rather than lost, a bamboo tube sealed at both ends. Inside, rolled tight, a death poem, written by a man who is not named in any record, found by someone who is also not named. Whether it was ever delivered, whether there was anyone left to deliver it to, the sources do not say. Hachiman Shrine was rebuilt. On its burned foundations, using the same stone and timber that the fire had blackened, the people of Tsushima, those who survived, those who returned, raised the walls and the roof again. The god of war, whose shrine had burned as a warning before the fleet arrived, now had a shrine rebuilt as a memorial to the men who had heard the warning and stood up anyway. The monument to Sukakuni still stands there. It has stood for 750 years. The second Mongol invasion came in 1281. It was not a refinement of the first. It was an act of imperial will made manifest in the largest naval operation of the medieval world. 4,400 ships, 140,000 soldiers and sailors, 2 separate fleets, coordinated to strike simultaneously from Korea and from southern China. Kublai Khan had spent 7 years learning from 1274, building a force that could not be turned back by samurai night raids or the loss of a single general. Japan had spent those same 7 years building the wall. When the Eastern Fleet arrived at Tsushima and Iki in June 1281, the islands fell again, quickly, as before, against defenders who had been reinforced but were still vastly outnumbered. But when the fleet reached Hakata Bay, it met the wall. 19 kilometers of stone that denied the mass beach landing. Samurai on the wall, who understood now how Mongol tactics worked, who knew not to answer drum formations with individual challenges, who launched their night raids from the first day rather than waiting for the battlefield to teach them. The siege of Hakata Bay lasted nearly 2 months. Not a samurai victory. The Mongols held position, the Japanese held position, and the strategic situation was a knife's edge, with neither side able to break it. Then, on August 15th, 1281, as the combined fleets prepared for the assault that would either take Kyushu or end the campaign, the sky changed again. The second typhoon destroyed most of 140,000 men's means of transport, survival, and retreat in a single night. The invading forces suffered casualties that historians still argue about, but which certainly approached or exceeded 50,000 dead. The survivors who made it to shore were hunted down by samurai who had spent 2 months watching them from the walls and who were ready, disciplined and merciless. The Japanese sources record that they spared the Song Chinese soldiers, who they regarded as unwilling participants conscripted into a Mongol war. But the Mongol and Korean officers who survived the storm were killed to the last man. Kublai Khan, receiving the news in Khanbalik, ordered a third invasion. He began construction. He mobilized resources. He died in 1294, and the third invasion died with him. The Yuan dynasty he founded would collapse entirely within a generation, worn down by the same combination of overextension, military overcommitment, and the peculiar vulnerability of empires that have never learned the word no. Japan had said no. The sky had enforced it, and from the ashes of that refusal, a nation built its identity. The word kamikaze was born from this. Divine wind, the breath of the gods intervening in human affairs, bending the world toward a specific outcome, preserving the sacred archipelago from the only force that had ever genuinely threatened it. This was not propaganda invented after the fact. This was the immediate interpretation of the people who stood on the shore and watched the storm do what they couldn't. They named it because the name was true, or felt true, which in a culture built on the relationship between human beings and divine forces amounts to the same thing. And then, 670 years later, in 1944 and 1945, Japanese pilots took that name for their own. They called themselves kamikaze. They flew their planes into American warships, choosing to become the divine wind rather than wait for it. The logic was the same logic that Sukakuni's 80 men had used on Komoda Beach. If we cannot win, we can choose how we lose, and that choice has meaning, and meaning matters more than survival. The horror and the heroism travelling together through the centuries, inseparable, finding new forms in new desperate circumstances, asking again the question that Tsushima had first asked in 1274. What changes when you understand that a civilization's self-image can be forged in defeat, but that the stories a people tell about themselves are not always stories of victory, and that sometimes the most foundational stories are the ones about the 80 who stood on the beach knowing they would die and stood there anyway. What happened on Tsushima changed Japanese warfare forever. The stone wall at Hakata was the first major military infrastructure built in Japan against a foreign enemy. The experience of fighting Mongol tactics forced samurai culture to begin the long, slow evolution away from ritual individual combat toward the mass tactics that would define later Japanese warfare. The psychological trauma of the women on the ships, that image, that message that the Mongols had deliberately composed and delivered, hardened something in the national consciousness that would not soften for centuries. That and the word Bushido, the way of the warrior, the philosophical code that would come to define samurai ethics for the world, was not written until generations after Tsushima. But its content, when it finally appeared in text, drew on the template of men who had faced impossible odds and refused to retreat. The horrors of 1274 demanded a language for why men die without running. Bushido provided it. Tsushima made it necessary. We look at these events now from the comfortable distance of 7.5 centuries, and we can see things that the people living through them could not. We can see that the Mongol Empire was already overstretched, that the logistical challenges of ocean warfare were genuinely beyond what their continental military genius had prepared them for, that the typhoons, while described as divine by their Japanese witnesses, have meteorological explanations that involve the South China Sea typhoon season and the geographic positioning of Hakata Bay. We can see dispassionately that Japan was saved by weather. But dispassion is not the only lens available to us, and the 80 samurai on Komoda Beach did not have the option of dispassion. Centuries later, tourists walk Komoda Beach in the August heat, taking photographs with phones that contain more computational power than anything Kublai Khan's engineers could have imagined. Children run on the same sand where the final cavalry charge ended. The sea is blue and flat and entirely benign. The monument to Sosukekuni stands where it has stood since the people of Tsushima raised it. We weathered by the same salt air that carried the sound of Mongol drums on the morning of November 5th, 1274, bleached by the same sun that rose over 900 ships and 80 men and the gap between them. He knew. He knew the ships were coming. He knew the numbers. He knew the history of what the Mongols did to islands that resisted them. He had seen the omen in the burning shrine. He had walked among his 80 men in the dark and looked at their faces and understood with the absolute clarity that only arrives when every other option has been removed what the next morning required. He rode anyway, not because he thought he could win, not because he believed the kami would intervene in time, not because he had a plan that the numbers could be made to work out. He rode because Tsushima was his and his father's before him. And because the people of this island were his people, and because some things are more important than the outcome, and because the alternative of not riding, of calculating the odds and finding them impossible, and making the reasonable choice and living, that alternative had a cost that he had decided, somewhere in the dark, before midnight on November 4th, he was not willing to pay. That decision, made in the dark by a man whose name we know only because he died making it, echoes across 750 years to reach us here. It does not resolve, it does not offer comfort, it does not explain the women on the ships, or the children, or the fishing family in their hut on the eastern shore, or the death poem in the bamboo tube. The horror and the heroism are woven together in this story, the way they are always woven together in the real history of real human beings in real extremity. But the monument stands. The beach exists. The name is remembered. He knew. He rode anyway.